It's clear from the report that network separation was the most critical factor in keeping the kiosk safe from attack. The Deloitte investigation shows that senior managers were never given the opportunity to assess the risk and take action to address it. From a management perspective, there seems to have been slack and sloppy internal processes and follow-up. There were serious deficiencies with project information and the interpretation of risk management policies. The paperwork, which was also seriously lacking, seems to show grossly inadequate follow-up, and as a result, network separation as a proposal dropped off the radar. There were a number of opportunities where security issues, including the need for network separation, were raised. It seems people woefully underestimated the risk of a malicious attack. Because there had never been an attack, people appear to have downplayed the risk and left a gap in which servers with corporate documents could be accessed and downloaded from the kiosks. It's important to note that the documents, which were invoices, could not be read on the kiosks. The Deloitte report tells us that the explicit threats and the network risks identified by Dimension Data were not addressed, and that senior management were not made aware of the consequences of failing to separate the kiosks from the MSD network. In terms of people's privacy, we are fortunate that the risk of harm from this is extremely low, because there were only 2 people who looked at a limited number of invoices. Both men returned all the information, and they have assured us and the Privacy Commissioner that they have not distributed it to anyone else. Of the 7,300 odd items on the USB stick, there were around 1,400 items that did contain some personal information, such as a person's name and or date of birth, and some description of the medical and legal service that was purchased. The vast majority of these had very little information in them. Of all the items downloaded, invoices relating to 8 children and 2 adults contained highly sensitive information. In the case of these 10 people, we will be working on how best to respond to them on a case-by-case basis. We're following the Privacy Commissioner's guidelines in determining who may have suffered harm from this breach. Sarah had some invoices in the system. They've been given all of their information, and they will be managing their response directly with their suppliers. There was no information from the Office of the Commissioner for Children or the Families Commission. And while I'm satisfied that there has been very little actual harm from this security breach, there is no doubt there was potential for a major privacy breach, and I want to apologise to New Zealanders for that. Around 68 people contacted us who were concerned about personal information stored with us. I'm glad we've been able to reassure those people that their information was not disseminated or shared. It's also important to remember that our Tier 1 systems, that is MSD's actual case file systems, were never under threat through the kiosk breach. I want to touch on the issue of accountability. I want to make it clear that I am holding people accountable for this very serious breach of our corporate system. However, I need to do this in a fair and equitable way. I have launched 4 employment investigations at this stage. I won't be drawn on the details of these, as they need to run their course before I can determine next steps. Deloitte have begun work today on phase 2 of this review, which will assess the appropriateness and effectiveness of the Ministry's wider IT security. It will also look at our policies, governance, capability, as well as our culture. The review will be completed by the end of November and feed into the wider IT security review being carried out by the government's CIO. Let me just finish with this. The breach was unacceptable. It was fixed within hours. People will be held accountable. But that will be done fairly and squarely. The privacy breach had a very limited impact. For those people who have been affected, we will do the right thing. I'll take questions now.
Being held accountable, does that include you?
I'm accountable and focused for making sure that we respond appropriately, and I'm pleased to say that the Deloitte report does indicate that the response to the breach and the shutting down of the kiosks and the approach from there has been appropriate and sound. Focusing very much on looking forward to make sure that whatever comes out of phase 2 of the review and whatever lessons we learn from here are appropriately implemented.
What sort of role are those people who investigating?
I'm not prepared to reveal that information.
How senior are they?
They are across a range of roles within the ministry.
You just said that.
Are they managers?
I'm not going into detail around what roles are.
Was it because they were aware of the security risks that why they're investigating?
There's a range of reasons, but at the heart of it is whether or not they acted appropriately with respect to the information that they had.
How far up the chain did it go in terms of the assessment of the risks associated with kiosks?
Look, Murray might like to comment on that with respect to the report, but the report makes it clear that at the heart of this was a failure to appropriately determine the risk and then to escalate it to people that could have made that decision. So in that respect, it never got to the level of seniority that I would have expected.
The information around security risks was largely held with the Energy Security Team of the project team that was working on the kiosk project. So there's no evidence of escalation beyond that point.
So that 10 cases where privacy information was revealed, why not just apologise to the people straight away?
Well, that's part of what we're considering now, and Rupert might like to comment on that because we've been working with the Privacy Commissioner's Office. Now that we've identified those 10 people, we need to go through a process to determine exactly what the nature of the contact is and how we go about resolving that.
As Brendan said, we're dealing with 8 children and 2 adults. We need to work through with representatives. We need to do it appropriately.
Would this include financial compensation?
Well, we'll discuss the effect with the representatives.
So it's an option.
What is being done to enhance security on the kiosks?
Well, the kiosks aren't in operation, so for a start,
But eventually they're going to have to come back online.
well, that's what we're looking at. To what extent can we get the kiosks up and running again, and what will be the security requirements? I can give you an assurance that they will not be going live again unless we are 100% sure to the highest possible standard that the security requirements are met, and that may involve full network separation. That's part of the options that are being looked at, but in the meantime, the kiosks remain offline.
And how concerned are you that this might have spread to other communication systems within the ministry?
Well, there's nothing in the phase 1 report that would indicate that level of concern, but that will continue to be looked at through phase 2.
Can I get back to privacy for a sec? The other 1,400 people that were on there that the private information wasn't considered highly sensitive, will any action be taken about those?
I mean, in general terms, we apologise publicly in relation to that. I think that information shouldn't have been available. But in terms of the assessment of the risk, we won't be proactively approaching each of those individuals. People have come to us and expressed concerns. We'll be able to, we have been able to confirm with them if their circumstances, if their information is contained within.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what you define as highly sensitive as opposed to not highly sensitive?
It was really a range of criteria moving up from how much information was contained on a particular item, and in the highly sensitive categories we had some detailed information about people's circumstances contained within an invoice, but there was sufficient detail contained within it for it to be particularly sensitive for those people.
So I assume something like the fact that someone owes a specific amount of money to MSD or is being investigated for fraud is not considered highly sensitive under that definition?
It's considered personal and it's considered personal information, but in terms of it being highly sensitive, no, they haven't got to the top category.
So if people want to know if their privacy was breached, they essentially have to ring Lynn and ask them.
We've had, as I indicated in my statement, we've had 68 people contact us and ask that question.
Do you think if you're one of these 1,400 people who applies to potentially bridge, wouldn't you like to know? Don't you have a duty to let these people know?
Well, we have a duty to make an assessment of the extent of risk of harm, and that's what we've done. Where we think that's of a sufficient sensitivity, that's when we're going to try and tell them.
Why not just tell all those 1,400 people?
There's a balancing between the impact of coming to tell people that their information is on and the risk that's with it. The criteria that we applied was the details that were in that and the extent to which the information had been released. And I think that we're fortunate to that extent that the information was promptly returned through the Privacy Commissioner and that we've got undertakings about the security of that information. It didn't go any further.
Brendan, you must be, how are you feeling about stage 2? Stage 1, as you say, is really gaming. This next stage is going to look at the whole sort of environment. How are you feeling about that?
Well, look, I see it as an opportunity. If we've got some gaps in our systems, we need to make sure that we close them. And if that's gaps in terms of the application of policies or even the application of IT security, I want to know about that. So there's an opportunity in this next phase of continuing to work with IT and Deloitte to get to the bottom of that and make whatever improvements are necessary to restore confidence.
Do you have the budget to close those gaps though, if you do find them? Because in this report it indicates that perhaps some of those security breaches or fix when the risk is best highlighted because of budget concerns.
I think part of the problem there is that there was no adequate assessment done of what the cost might be, for example, around network separation, so that anyone could make a decision about what the trade-offs were likely to be in terms of the cost versus the risk.
There is a figure for it. It's 101,000.
Not sure what that relates to, Steve.
So is it fair to say though that there would be a culture of trying to keep costs down and obviously the separation of networks would cost a lot more money than the option they went for, and so
Well,
that's what people went with.
Every organisation operates in an environment where they're looking at the cost-benefit trade-offs in terms of making decisions around systems. We're no different to any public or private sector organisation in that sense.
But these are IT people, you would expect that they would have a fair idea of what kind of risks would be if
There was
didn't
nothing,
separate
Murray
networks.
might want to comment on it, but there was nothing with respect to the investigation that gave me any concern that decisions were made on the basis of resource allocation or cost.
And that's correct. Clearly, separating the network either physically or logically does cost money, but it's not of the magnitude that's beyond the capability of the industry to actually do that. So achieved by organising.
But even in the final business case, there was no discussion of security risks at all.
There was security risks, and again Murray might want to comment, but there are security risks that were detailed up to certain stages of the project. I think that's one of the discoveries from the investigation. The idea of network separation, which was a very sound proposal, dropped off the radar, and that is unexplained.
So really, I mean, it's down to the actions of these key managers. I mean, you've kind of already touched on this, but how would you describe your inaction given these emails presenting these three separate units?
Well, that's part of the employment investigations, and more generally to make sure that across the ministry that we've got people that are taking appropriate action and determination of risk, that they escalate issues to the right level, and that they make sure that those sort of trade-offs around risk and service delivery are well understood. And unfortunately, that did not happen in this case.
That figure, it's on the front page of part 15, 199,000 to put security license on every router. So one possible benefit has been quantified.
There was no, as I said though, with respect to network separation, there was no detailed work or costs that were done associated with that.
How can you be sure that no one else has access to this information? We were told by the minister throughout that the only way they could know was if someone came forward and made the same decision.
Technically that's true. We have done analysis as best we can to determine whether there's been any other download pattern similar to what we saw with Mr. and Mr. Bailey. There has not been to date. We will continue to do that testing, but again, I think as I said at the first press conference a fortnight ago, if people have information, we would be grateful if they came forward.
If somebody does try a similar thing again, is there a criminal sanction? I have in mind that the relevant clause of the Crimes Act has an exception that says if you're allowed to access a computer system for any purpose, it is not a crime for you to access it for another purpose. It's a curious exclusion, 262 section, subsection 2, I
I
think.
might refer that one to my chief legal advisor.
You didn't know that?
I haven't practiced law for a while. Rupert.
There's certain criminal provisions that as you say, are contained in the Crime Act, specifically related to access of computer systems. It's not up to me to determine whether these fit within that criteria. I think that there are agencies who look at that, and we'll at least have specialised agencies focused on that.
Murray, the report shows there's access or mapping done from kiosk on 4th of October, and you can't confirm who made those connections.
That's right, it's not technically feasible.
So you establish whether it's one of those two gentlemen who's reported this.
Neither of two gentlemen believe that there was access by them on that day.
So it could have been a third person or a third.
It's possible.
Do you know what was accessed?
Similar.
So there could be another person who got some information. So
There could be, or there could be some confusion around the dates of the individuals. So I wouldn't rule that out either.
So given that the employment investigations will be specifically talking to the people who made these decisions, are we ever going to find out about why they didn't act, why they didn't escalate it up the chain, why they didn't respond as they should have?
Look, I'll have to consider that once we've been through the investigations as to what extent that we can relay that when they're concluded. I can't say at this point.
You today in the report both talk about the lack of escalation up through, but are you satisfied that, I'm looking through the documents you've released today, that January 2006 risk management procedures that you've got in place, that the risk and assurance business unit and various managers fulfilled their responsibility to alert people, make sure that information was flowing to them?
Well, that will be part of what we look at in phase 2, but with respect to the, I don't know whether Murray wanted to make any particular comment, but I'm satisfied that if the individuals had done an appropriate risk analysis and escalated it to the right levels of governance, that we may be very, very well not sitting here today.
I guess I'm asking the question the other way around, though. Are you satisfied that the managers and the people who are mandated to identify risk and advise your department how that risk should be managed, that they fulfilled their role in alerting those managers of those IDs who didn't escalate it to what they should do?
There's nothing in the report that gives me that sort of concern, Vernon. However, again, in phase 2, we'll be making sure that when we look at the application of policies and the culture across the ministry around risk management, that's part of it.
So you're trying to figure out whether the stuff up comes down to 4 people or something like that.
Well, I want to be able to determine whether this is an aberration with a particular project, or whether there is, whether there are other issues that we need to make sure that we get on top of. But either way, we'll be making sure in terms of policies and procedures that we're tightening up considerably.
What's your feeling on it?
Too soon to say. There's nothing that came through phase 1 that gives me a concern any more than what I had at the beginning of the process.
Are there any plans to look at internal access to the documents? So I'm just looking at the meeting for the security review here that says, agreed that there's a problem related to the wider MSD network, and that was specifically related to permissions to access documents within the network.
Sorry, what was the question?
Are there plans to look at internal access? Who else might have inappropriately accessed that data within the MSD network?
The data that was on those particular kiosks, well, that was part of the access and the download patterns that we looked at in phase 1 and are continuing to test for.
So that wasn't just people accessing from kiosks, but also internally within the network?
Murray,
No,
differentiate there.
the focus is on access through the kiosks only for this particular phase.
You have to remember though, there would have been many people within the ministry who were quite legitimately accessing that information for their jobs.
Would there have been people apart from the accounting, invoicing team that had legitimate reason to access those data?
Possibly, if people had authorities to sign off invoices, etc., and they were making decisions. I mean, okay, I think that's all. Thanks very much.